The Internet History Podcast is brought to you by MetaLab. Their slogan is MetaLab, we make interfaces. For a decade, MetaLab has helped some of the world's top companies and entrepreneurs build products that millions of people use every day. You probably didn't realize it at the time, but the odds are you've used an app that they've helped design or build. Apps like Slack, Coinbase, Facebook Messenger, Oculus, Lonely Planet, and many more. MetaLab wants to bring their unique design philosophy to your project. Let them take your brainstorm and turn it into the next billion-dollar app, from idea sketched on the back of a napkin to a final shipped product. Check them out at metalab.co. That's metalab.co. Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. So, we've had a couple of people come on here to discuss how the New York Times got online, but the spiritual yin to the Times' yang is the Wall Street Journal, of course, and we haven't done enough to explore their path to embracing the internet. And it's worth doing that because the Journal embraced a different model from basically day one. Almost alone among the web media pioneers, the Journal went the subscription route. So today we're going to talk to Rich Jaroslovsky, who headed the team that brought the Journal online, to see why they went that route, to learn about the path to the web, and much more. So much more, in fact, that this is another one I'm going to split into two episodes, not just because we had to, for scheduling reasons, do this in two different recording sessions, and not just because Rich had so much great stuff to say that it really deserves two episodes, but because there's a deeper story in the second half of this that touches on other things we've talked about, even going back to Netscape. So please enjoy part one of a conversation with Rich Jaroslovsky. Rich Jaroslovsky, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I kind of like to start with first principles a little bit. You went to school, I can't remember now, from your LinkedIn profile. Was it like political science or something like that?
Yes, I was a poli-sci major at Stanford.
At Stanford in the early 70s?
Yeah.
How did you, well, actually, before that, before you get into journalism, just real quickly, and you don't have to have a lot of detail on this, but because it's gotten to be so famous later, and we actually might talk about this later, Stanford as a supportive place for startup culture, did you witness any of that or experience any of that? Was that in place in the 70s when you were in school there?
It was certainly coalescing at that time. And, in the years since, every time I start to get a little too impressed with my own, great journalistic insight, I remind myself that it was happening all around me for 4 years, and I was basically completely oblivious to it. It was definitely going on, but it was sort of mysterious. And, looking back on it now, I think what an incredible missed opportunity.
As I said, or as you alluded to, you did end up going into journalism. Was that accidental, or what was your path to the Wall Street Journal?
I'm one of these really weird people. When I was about 12 years old, I went to work on my junior high school newspaper up in Santa Rosa, California. And I remember thinking quite clearly after a month or so of working on the Herbert Slater Junior High School Senator that, this is what I'm going to do with my life. I fell in love with journalism at an early age, and I've never fallen out of love with it.
Is it the craft of it? Is it the being a writer part of it? What's the thing that really appeals to you?
I think it's the craft. It's the craft of it. It is, like many journalists, I'm kind of an introvert masquerading as an extrovert. And I think journalism has always given me a socially acceptable reason to be curious or ask questions or force myself a little bit out of my comfort zone. So I fell in love with it, just immediately. And I worked on my junior high school paper, and I worked on my high school paper, and I was editor of the Stanford Daily. When I was a junior in college, I got an internship working at the Wall Street Journal in New York between my junior and senior years. And I fell in love with that and was lucky enough that the Journal hired me back straight out of school. So I got my diploma 1 week, and the next week was starting at the Journal in their what was then their Cleveland bureau.
I don't even mean this in any way negatively or pejoratively or anything, but it's hard not to look at that as like the golden era now, where you're a kid coming right out of school, you get an entry level position and you work your way up, and this is you're at the Wall Street Journal, one of the greatest newspapers in the world, and like just that whole concept that you can build a career. And again, I don't think I'm being doom and gloom about media and journalism, but there's no way that I can talk to you about that and not bring up the context of like this was the golden era. This was when you could make your bones and become a beat reporter and then make a career in journalism when it was a capital J.
You're right and you're wrong in some ways. I think particularly my time at the Journal, at Dow Jones, its parent company, which was the pre-Rupert Murdoch era, when it was one of the most admired companies in the country. I feel like I was incredibly blessed and lucky to be at the Journal at the time I was, and to be in journalism at the time I was. By the same token, there's a line from a Billy Joel song that goes something like, "The good old days weren't always good, and tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems."
Yeah.
And I kind of feel that way too. I mean, I've seen tremendous changes in the business, tremendous changes in journalism, but the eternal verities of journalism are still valid, and it's still a craft that is capable of honor.
Absolutely. And by the way, I probably with that question got a little ahead of ourselves. But okay. Wall Street Journal, I think you started in 75. You at some point you're a White House correspondent, a political editor, columnist, all sorts of things. I'm wondering, maybe what would be helpful is the context of which I've spoken to with other people, the experiments that were being done as early as the 70s, all throughout the 80s, into the early 90s, by especially the newspaper industry, but media in general, for digital media. I've spoken to other people about, all of the various, Knight Ridder experiments and things like that. So if again, since you teach this sort of thing, I wonder if you could just give me either an overall context of the experiments that were being done in digital media in the 70s and 80s, or even your personal experience with some of those experiments.
Well, the overall, I mean, there was a lot of work being done, and some of it you look back and it was really prescient. I teach a class in the history of online news at Berkeley, and we go back and look at things like teletext and video text, which were early technologies, in some cases trying to use TV waves to deliver on-screen information. Things like the work that Roger Fidler at Knight Ridder was doing in developing, his magic screen or whatever he called it, which today you look at and go, well, that was an early iPad. There was a lot of work going on at that time, and I was aware of it, and sort of mildly interested in it, but it really wasn't what I was about. I was, for most of that period, I was a political journalist. As you say, I got to the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal in 1976. I got to cover politics. I got to cover, the White House, flew on Air Force One a lot, did all those things, all those sort of glamorous things, or at least they appear to be glamorous from a distance about Washington journalism. And so while I was aware of all these experiments, they weren't super relevant to me. The way that my two worlds collided was a little bit more roundabout than that. I inherited, I think, from my dad, a general love of gadgets and toys and things, electronic things, calculators, whatever. In the 70s, late 70s, there was this marvelous book that came out called The Soul of a New Machine, which won a
Tracy
Pulitzer.
Kidder, yes.
Tracy Kidder, exactly. Won a Pulitzer Prize. It's a great book about the designing of a new mini computer at I want to say Data General, which was a company around at that point. And I read the book, and it's just a great piece of journalism. And I understood maybe 20% of this computer stuff, but it was really interesting. And so I went out and bought myself at Toys R Us an Atari 400, which was essentially a toy computer, but a real computer. And I started playing with it and just trying to figure out how it worked. And, I would come into work every day. I was covering energy policy at that point, and my partner on the energy beat was a guy named Walt Mossberg, who also had a love of gadgets. And so every morning, I'd come in and I'd be blathering on about this gadget and saying, well, Mossberg, you've got to go out and get one of these yourself. Walt actually wasn't sure he'd get into it. So instead of spending $269 for an Atari, he bought something called the Timex Sinclair for about $59, which hooked up to a black and white TV, and which, by the way, he still has. Of course, he went on to become the nation's preeminent technology columnist and commentator. But I was much more interested in just, learning what the technology could do. But for years, he and I would, we bought our first Apple IIs together. We bought our first modems together. And when I got married, my then new wife said to me, if you're going to keep buying these expensive new toys to keep up with Mossberg, you're going to have to figure out some way to pay for them. So I started writing on a freelance basis for computer magazines. And I wrote, for a long time, I'd cover politics, I'd write my political column or something, at the Journal. And then I'd come home at night and go upstairs and play with my computer toys and write about them for magazines like A+, which was an Apple II magazine, Computer Shopper, which was a Ziff Davis magazine that used to be about the size of a phone book every month. So I got comfortable with technology.
Let me interrupt real quick, because again, this is one thing that I've talked to other people about. This idea that we're used to, there's a whole blogosphere today, there's a whole industry covering tech as a mainstream consumer obsession, right? But in the 80s, like you're describing the magazine as a phone book, that's because essentially all of those publications were industry publications, right? They weren't necessarily tailored towards my mom or to your average consumer, right?
Right. They weren't necessarily industry as in B2B type thing, but they were for the enthusiast. They were for the hobbyist. They were for people for whom computers and technology was a hobby and a passion, not necessarily a business opportunity, and not necessarily a part of an average person's everyday life. It was sort of exotic and mysterious. And when Walt and I would be talking about computers in the office, our colleagues, would sort of wander past and roll their eyes at us. there's Walt and Rich blathering on again about bits and bytes, and it was probably we were probably objects of some laughter because we were into this stuff. But as it turned out, that was critically important to both of our careers.
But at the same time, within the media industry, there is a digital revolution happening. So that I'm sure when you got started, it was sort of what you see in black and white movies where it's all typewriters and rows of desks and things like that. But you had to have been around for the digital revolution in publishing taking over. And I'm talking not in a consumer level or a mainstream level, but specifically in the journalism and media space.
Well, the journal was always kind of interesting because the journal had its production system was highly advanced for its era. The journal really pioneered the notion of being able to publish basically the same newspaper in multiple points around the country. They used microwave and then satellites to bounce images off, to be able to enable publishing all over the country. But at the same time, the sort of front end system, the system that the reporters and editors used, the journal was somewhat late to technology. And so it arrived, our first computer terminals, which were these hideous devices made by a company called Delta Data. That was fairly late. We could sort of see it happening at other places, but we didn't feel it as much at the journal. What was going on at a lot of other places, and at Dow Jones too, the journal's parent company, in fairness, was everybody could see that that there was a digital future, but nobody could quite figure out what it was. And some of those early experiments that we talked about, a little while ago, teletext, videotext, some of those were sort of epic disasters for the companies that tried to launch them. So you had on the one hand, you had a vision that yes, digital was going to be important and it was going to revolutionize things. But on the other hand, you had a string of failed and in some cases embarrassingly failed experiments that left the media industry kind of gun shy. You could see the future, but you didn't know how to get there.
So, and if I'm skipping over anything that you think is important, please interject right now. But so bringing us up to the 90s, when there starts to be things like online services and BBSs, are you personally starting to see some of experiments and moves made in those directions?
Yeah, well, what you had in the 90s, the first part of the 90s, you had the rise of dial-up consumer online services like CompuServe and Prodigy, and eventually, of course, AOL, which were more consumer friendly, which suffered from being, terribly slow and oftentimes because you were dialing up over phone lines. There were all sorts of disadvantages, but at least they were they were penetrating the consumer consciousness. And at Dow Jones, the key guy, I think, through the history of WSJ.com, was an executive in the electronic publishing division of Dow Jones, a guy named Neil Buddy. And Neil had this idea that, that online was definitely the wave of the future. And he had an approach to trying to bring the Wall Street Journal online. Now, this was probably about 1993, 1994, and probably really 1993. And at this point, the web was barely a glimmer in most normal people's eyes.
Right.
And the big thing was AOL. And so the original vision of what became WSJ.com was not a website. It was a dial-up internet service similar to AOL. We would give people, the idea was we would give people dial-up software, just like AOL had, and people would, over their telephone lines, dial up, Dow Jones servers in South Brunswick, New Jersey, and we'd have our own online service, and that would be the online Wall Street Journal. And I joined the project at a point where there was, I think at that point, there were like 4 of us on the entire team. I got approached when I was in Washington. They were looking for somebody who, at least wasn't terrified of the technology. And because of my background as a hobbyist and as a freelance writer, I was comfortable around the technology. And they offered me this job of being the news guy, of being the managing editor of this non-existent online service. And when I talked it over with my wife, and we decided that even though it was totally untried and it was a leap into the unknown, but it was like too tempting to pass up. My colleagues in Washington were baffled. I remember at least one of them used the phrase career suicide, to describe, you're going where to do what? And people at that point in the print newsroom had no idea why I was doing this. And you're by that point I was national political editor in the Washington bureau. I was writing the Washington Wire column that ran on page 1. I'd had a pretty well-known byline after 18 years in Washington, and my colleagues were totally baffled by why I would be doing this. But it seemed like too good an opportunity to pass up. So when I joined the project, and for the first year I was on the project, we spent the entire time trying to build a model for an online dial-up service. And, Neil knew from the beginning sort of how it should work and what it should be. A guy named Tom Baker joined as our chief business person, and Tom, dial-up services you used to pay for. And so we, from the beginning, assumed that we would be charging people something for this service, if only because we were going to have telecommunications costs from all these people dialing up Dow Jones servers.
Which I'm going to interrupt for context here. You used to have to pay, especially if you're calling outside your area code, you used to have to pay per minute. And so, right, it's not just you turn it on and you use it to your heart's content and you pay a certain amount. It was metered.
Oh yeah, it was metered, by the minute. And when AOL went to a flat subscription for all you could use, the result was so much online paralysis that people were joking that the name of the service wasn't America Online, it was America on Hold. So it was very much, you were trying to cram an awful lot of information through a very, very small portal. The longer that people stayed online, the more expensive it got. You were tying up your telephone, which meant that nobody else could call you. Most people didn't have voicemail then. So people would be, you'd be online for 45 minutes and anyone who tried to call you would get a busy signal and you'd get a bill and you'd go, how much, geez, I was on for 45 minutes. It's $9 or $10 for that session. So it was, that was the environment that we started working in.
But now also conversely, there's an obvious business model there because again, the Dow Jones, the Journal can charge per the minute, per the hour. So is the concept for that original online service, was it a regurgitation of just the print edition, or were there more ambitious goals and ideas?
There were definitely more ambitious goals and ideas, because especially when, in my view, this was a wonderful sandbox to be able to experiment with stuff and be able to do things in a different way. I used to have this argument with friends of mine at the New York Times, for example, where the New York Times had a rule that the print version of a New York Times story, when it went online, it was inviolable. You could not change that story once, because the print version was the final version of that story. It was the version for history. And I took the exact opposite approach from the beginning. I said, no, no, no. News happens all the time. And if the journal publishes a story in the print paper that says President Clinton will do this today, and then President Clinton does it, we need to update the story. It needs to be much more dynamic than the sort of static. But these things now, another thing that I planned on from the beginning was that it would be a 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year service. It would be continuously updated. And that notion was, it seems so self-evident today. But in 1993 or 1994, nobody knew anything. And so we were kind of making it up as we went along. I'll tell you, I'll digress and tell you a little story. I've told this for years. When I was a student at Stanford in 1973, I took a class from a much beloved communication professor named Bill Rivers, which was essentially a speaker series. He would bring speakers in from, various media speakers, and we got like one unit for the class. Well, one day he invites in a guy named Joe Noland. Now, Joe Noland was then the publisher of the Oakland Tribune, and he must have been, I think he's way up in his 80s now, so he must have been in his 40s, early 40s or something. And Joe Noland was sort of, how do I put this nicely? The students all assumed he was crazy. He was jumping around in front of the class, waving his arms and talking absolute nonsense. And the nonsense would be things like, in the future, you're going to be getting your newspaper off a TV screen. Mm-hmm. And remember, this is 1973. No one even has ever heard the term personal computer. And we were going, you're going to be getting news off of a newspaper on a screen? Well, what if you want to take it with you? You'll have something, attached to your TV so you can print it out, but no one's really going to want to do that. Well, how are you going to publish this? How often does it, you publish it once a day, right? And because that's what you do with a newspaper. And Nolan was saying, no, you don't publish it once a day. It's always being published. And we said, well, what do you mean it's always being published? He'd say, well, if news happens, it's reflected immediately. And we said, well, do you mean that if I come in and access my newspaper and you come in 10 minutes later, that the newspaper might be different? And he said, yeah. And we all of us students after this performance said, this guy's out of his mind. Flash forward 20 years when we were doing the planning for what became WSJ.com. And every time some issue would come up about, well, when are you going to publish? How's it going to, we're going to publish all the time. You're going to what? And anytime any issue came up that I didn't have a ready answer for, I'd think back to that speech from Joe Noland. And I said, well, Joe Noland said it would be this way, so let's try it this way. A lot of those things, we thought he was out of his mind. He was 20 plus years ahead of his time. He went on, by the way, to become a character actor. He had a small part in the Star Trek movie, the one with the whales.
4, yeah.
and he's still around. I believe he's still living in the East Bay. A few years ago, I got his email address and I sent him a note, and I, explained my role in the early days of online news. And I said, if you ever saw, online news doing things, and said to yourself, that's the way I thought it would happen back in 1973. I said, there's a reason for that. There's a direct line from the nonsense that we all assumed he was spewing, to what we actually were able to do 20, 25 years later.
Well, and he inspired you to do it as well.
As well.
So the online service that you're creating a team to build, does it actually launch before the web goes mainstream, and then everyone has to realize, oh, we got to do the web?
What actually happened was, turned out to be a blessing in disguise. I think that the Dow Jones technical people had vastly underestimated the complexity of building an AOL-style dial-up online service, from scratch. And so the project, the completion date for this online service kept getting pushed back and back. And meanwhile, we were beginning to see, the early days of the web beginning to take hold. And Neil had the vision and the courage to say, you know what, we've already spent a year and a half in going in this direction, but we need to be going in that direction. In the parlance of the time, we felt like we were off building a really cool Betamax when the rest of the world was getting ready to go VHS. And, kids, go ask your grandparents what Betamax and VHS were. But Neil really, and I give him all the credit in the world for this, he basically went to Dow Jones executives and with support from the rest of us on the team, and he told them, we're doing this the wrong way. We need to stop what we're doing with a dial-up online service and move everything to the web. The web is the way of the future. We can move much faster and more nimbly on the web. Basically throw out 80% of what we've already done, start over, but build this business on the web. And that was probably, late 1994, early 1995. Mm-hmm. And by the summer of 1995, we had a prototype of WSJ.com up and running on the web and publicly available. We called it the Money and Investing Update, and it ran from early '95 to when we morphed it into the full-fledged Wall Street Journal online in spring of 1996.
Okay, before we get to that, a few structural questions here. You've got to build a team, and as you even said, it was like it was a bit of soul searching for you. Like, do I want to go off and do this thing that's career suicide? Is this Siberia for me? So when you're building the team and you're trying to put this together, are you hiring people from outside the journal, or are you bringing people over? Like, how was it difficult to build the team because of that whole Siberia career suicide thing?
It was the single thing that I am proudest of from that entire era was the team that I was able to build. I was able to bring in people who never would have gotten in the door of the journal, the traditional journal, and some of them, many of them, surprising number, are still there today in very important jobs in the organization. You have to remember that at the time that we were doing this, there was no such thing as a digital journalist. And so we had to basically mint our own. And the way I went about it was I didn't know what skills would be, the entire skill set that would be necessary. But I went looking for people who had skills in one particular area that I knew would be useful, and who had the intellectual curiosity and flexibility to learn what it was they didn't already know. So, I knew that because we were planning to be continuously updated, I wanted some people who were familiar with, the 24-hour news cycle. So I, went looking for people who had experience in all news radio, for example. I knew that, especially in the early days, news production, the actual getting of the content into the online service, was going to be a production effort. So I went looking for people who had experience in organizing news production. I knew that it would be an incredibly fast-moving environment because we were going to be updating continuously. So I went looking for some people who had wire service experience. The common element was that everybody was interested in learning stuff they didn't already know. And it was incredibly wonderful and gratifying to see basically the staff taught each other digital journalism because, the all news radio person didn't know anything about news production, but they wanted to learn. And the news production person didn't know anything about, how a wire service journalist thought, but they were eager to learn. And out of that, that agglomeration of talents and skills and that desire to learn more, that's really what gave birth to this first generation of digital journalists.
So one thing that I do like to ask, I'm not asking you to remember the date it went live, but I always like to ask people because these things are down the memory hole now. And actually, I didn't even make a note of what you called it. But the thing that you launched on the web, and we're saying summer of '94, I think you said. If I was there, if I was online that day, or summer of '95, sorry, what would I have seen? And yeah, what would I have seen?
You would have seen something called the Money and Investing Update, which is actually, I think if you go to the Internet Archive, you can still pull up a couple,
Mm.
which was essentially the analog or the digital analog, if that's not a contradiction in terms, to the third section of the journal, the Money and Markets section. It had a news summary on the homepage that linked to stories about business and finance. It had some worldwide news. It had markets, stories about the markets, about business related stuff. It was essentially a subsection of the Wall Street Journal. I can tell you exactly when it went away. The date is forever burnished. I think it was April, I want to say April 29th, 1996 was the launch of the full, what we then called the Wall Street Journal Interactive Edition, which was extremely memorable. We were early to the web. There was a lot of anticipation about, and people had already seen the Money and Investing update for 8 or 9 months, but this was the next big thing. This was the big thing on the internet. And so there was a lot of anticipation. And we had arranged for one of my colleagues in Europe was going to do a press conference and demonstration in Europe. And then we were going to do one in New York. And we had all this thing planned out. So I get in, we were going to launch it on a Monday. And I get in at about 10 o'clock Sunday morning. And the Journal newsroom in New York is completely deserted. And I knew that pretty soon people would start coming in and, for launch and everything. And I announced to an empty newsroom, the Wall Street Journal Interactive Edition is now perpetually open for business. And I was very ceremonious about it. And I was very, from now on, the Wall Street Journal was always going to be online. There were always going to be journalists on duty.
Perpetual. Yeah.
Pardon?
Perpetual. Yeah.
Perpetual. And about 10 minutes later, the people running the servers down in South Brunswick called me and said, Rich, just to give you a heads up, we're going to prepare for the launch, we're going to recycle all of the servers. We're going to reboot everything. So, it'll be about 10 minutes, 15 minutes before you can actually start moving copy to the servers. And I said, great. And they did this recycling of the servers, and the entire damn system crashed.
It's always the way.
And it was down for about 12 hours.
Now, the advantage is, though, I mean, I'm sure there were people looking for this or whatever, and obviously you guys are anticipating it, but, you know, it's still in the days when you're disappointing 1,000 people, not 1 billion, maybe.
There was a lot of interest in what the journal was doing. We had press conferences set up. The media, you know, there was European media wanted to see, U.S. media. This was a really big deal at the time. And we were totally paralyzed. For 10 to 12 hours, we could do nothing. And we're watching the clock, and we're realizing that, you know, it's going to be 7 a.m. New York time was when the European press conference was supposed to happen. And we had no way of publishing. And so I called my wife and I said, I'm not coming home tonight. Please pack a bag, an overnight bag. And, you know, we sent a courier to my house out in New Jersey to pick up this bag and bring it to the office. Finally, at about 11 o'clock at night, you know, the servers, we got the servers back. And we worked like crazy all night trying to populate the pages. And I don't know if we've ever publicly admitted this, but basically my colleague Phil Revson, who was doing the European launch of WSJ.com, we called Phil and said, okay, we've been able to populate this page, that page, and this page. So here's the path that you can take in your demo so that people won't hit error 404 messages. And so we basically, you know, he was showing off a Potemkin version of the Wall Street Journal. Meanwhile, we kept furiously working and working. Finally, at about 7 in the morning, you know, Neil and I, who had been, you know, working with the staff all night, went across the street to the World Trade Center where we had reserved rooms when we saw we weren't going home that night. We'd reserved rooms in the Marriott or the Hilton International, whatever it was then, in the World Trade Center. And we checked in at 7 a.m. And I tell people it was the world's most expensive shower because I had tried to get some sleep for an hour before our U.S. press conference. There was no way. I was so wired. There was no way I was going to sleep. So I literally, all I did in that room was take a shower, shave, put my suit on, and walk back across the street to the Journal office. We then had our U.S. press conference, which was a total disaster because there were so many people hitting the Journal website that Neil, you know, couldn't get the pages to load, even though they had content, because the servers were just overwhelmed with people who were, you know, wanted to see what we were doing.
And it's probably even mostly text too, right?
It was mostly text, although there were some graphics too. The Journal itself was pretty text heavy back then. But there were, you know, the traffic on that first day was overwhelming. And, you know, which I think was a good thing. It was a mark of how excited people were to see that, you know, an organization as professionally respected as the Journal was embracing the internet, which in itself was news at that point, because the internet was still sort of viewed as the wild and woolly, you know, internet. And you still had people saying, you know, no one will ever depend on the internet for reliable information. And here was the Journal, this respected organization, embracing the internet and saying, yes, they will. And moreover, not only that, not only will people be willing to trust information they get from the internet, but even more revolutionary for the time, we said people would pay for it.
If you like what you've heard on this episode, please support us by subscribing to the podcast so you can get great news stories and conversations every 2 weeks. And please buy the book that was based on this podcast, How the Internet Happened, From Netscape to the iPhone, by me, Brian McCullough. Order it now wherever books are sold. How the Internet Happened. And if you weren't aware, I host a daily tech news podcast every weekday that comes out at 5 p.m. In that show, I tell you what happened that day in the world of tech. It's only 15 to 20 minutes long, and it's great if you love tech news. Search your podcast app for Ride Home to find the show. It's called the Tech Meme Ride Home. Thanks.